Good evening. This is my third short video for my critical thinking class, Luther Rice College in 2018. In this book by J.P. Moreland in chapter 10, he gives us 3 suggestions on how to improve the health of the church. The first suggestion being not to have any senior pastors in the church. I want to talk about that for just a few moments tonight, if I could. Professor Crawford, Mr. Moreland seems to think that a church having a senior pastor gives the opportunity for that pastor to have a large ego, and it gives the opportunity for the congregation to be a passive congregation. And it also, he cites that it gives the senior pastor all the voice. He seems to think that the pulpit should be led by a group of elders along with a pastor, putting the pastor in the same group as the elders, and that the pulpit should have plurality into it. In other words, having a different voice in the pulpit in order to bring different ideas and maybe different sermons or different context. He goes on to kind of lead us to think that the senior pastor in churches these days are looked on more as a CEO of a large corporation than they are the pastor of a church. They've got everything on their plate. They take care of everything in the church, and they shouldn't have that much responsibility. He goes on to say in his book that no one has that kind of knowledge, no one has that kind of talent. Not one person should be able to lead a church in the way that a senior pastor does. He goes on to say that he believes that, like I've already said, there should be a group of elders that equips the saints for going out and evangelizing, seeking lost souls, and so on and so forth. He kind of touches on the idea that without having a senior pastor, the people in the church wouldn't become, what's the word that he uses, they wouldn't become dependent upon one person, that the dependency would be spread out among a group of people in the church, and according to his opinion, that would be more healthy for the church. He goes on to talk a little bit more about this senior pastor thing, and he says with having a senior pastor that the congregants are more liable to fall in line with that senior pastor's beliefs, that senior pastor's convictions, so on and so forth. He believes that having different voices and philosophy in the pulpit, I don't agree with that tonight. I never have agreed with that. I believe that a senior pastor has his place in the church. I believe that a senior pastor should be looked on as the pastor, as the shepherd of the church, the leader. And I believe that if the senior pastor had, say, an associate pastor or a group of elders to work hand in hand with him, I believe that the church congregation would be better off for that. And what I mean by that is, Mr. Moreland seems to think that the elders of the church should be teaching and leading people in order to help them learn how to evangelize. I tend to think that the elders of the church should be taking care of the church business. I think that the elders of the church should be taking some of the load off of the pastor outside of biblical mandates. Excuse me. I think that the church elders has their place in the church also. I certainly do. But I think too often these days, in the last 20 or 30 years, I think too often the pastor has so much pressure on him with things outside the sermon on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. A lot of churches these days look to the pastor for lawn maintenance, building maintenance. If the air conditioner breaks, the pastor's got to be the one that says get it fixed. Things like that should be taken care of by a board member or an elder of the church, in my view. Mr. Moreland, he totally is all the way against that. He does not believe that way. I believe tonight that the church would function more properly if everybody done what they were supposed to be doing. Too often today, you have a board of elders in the church that tries to undermine what the pastor is trying to do. And all pastors are not paid pastors. There's some that actually work jobs. Some even go to school. And then, they do need help. I'm not saying that a pastor can do everything in the church. I'm not saying that a senior pastor should have to do everything in the church. But I'm saying tonight that opposite of Mr. Moreland's suggestions, I believe that everybody's got their place in the church. As far as elders goes, I think elders could help the pastor in the forms and the functions of the church. The function of the church being the absolute biblical mandates that all churches should be doing, such as worshiping God and evangelizing and drawing in people by being an example to the community. The function of the church. Then you got the form of the church. The form is what we do in order to carry out the function of the church, such as Sunday school, Bible school, youth groups, so on and so forth. I think that if the elders could possibly take that off of the senior pastor's load, I think it would help him quite a bit. And if a Sunday school curriculum's not working, get rid of it, replace it, find something better. And I believe that would be better served under the direction of the elders of the church. If vacation Bible schools are not evangelizing, if it's not drawing people into the church, then something needs to be done about it. And again, I believe that should fall under the elders of the church in order to find better ideas, find better ways to do things, and bring them before the pastor and talk things through and not undermine, but do their part in order to see that the function of the church becomes reality. You got youth groups today, another form that we use to see to it that the function of the church works properly. The youth groups today is too many times that youth groups are nothing more than keeping kids off of the street. Bring them to church, call it a youth group, have bonfires, have movie nights or skating parties or whatever the case may be. But I believe it should be up to the elders to be making sure that these youth groups, as we call them, are actually learning about the ways and the things of God to be able to be better Christians and to grow into people with Christian characters. The form and the function of the church is primarily what I believe the elders should be over. I look at a church today that wouldn't have a senior pastor, a shepherd to lead the people. I believe that if you tried to bring this into the church and say we're not going to have a senior pastor anymore, we're going to have a group of elders that's going to lead the church, I believe it would cause a large disruption in the church and possibly a split. One thing that I don't think Mr. Moreland has touched on tonight in this book is the fact that a lot of times the senior pastor is kin to a lot of the people in the church, maybe, or has become really good friends with a lot of people in the church, and you would have a certain percentage of the people in the church that they would rise against that. There's no way that they would function under that kind of leadership in the church. And then you have the older people in the church that's maybe been there since the church was built, or maybe their families founded the church or whatever, and they're not going to go for change as much as the young new Christian will. I will agree tonight that Mr. Moreland would probably he'd probably get better reviews from a young Christian, someone that's just come into the church and don't know how things are going. I'm not against change in the church. I think the church needs to be steadily changing, steadily becoming that church of tomorrow. I don't think we should be stuck in our ways and stuck in the past, but I also think that we need to take time out and think about what it would take to improve the health of the church, and I believe that removing the senior pastor from his position in church would be literally tearing the heart out of the church. Like I said, pastor's got his place, the elders has got their place, and the church members, as passive as they are, they don't want change. A lot of them, they're happy where they're at. They're happy with the way things are going. They don't see no reason to change. They kind of stick to the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, when you're a passive-minded person sitting in a church, it's very easy to not see the break in it. I know that there's a lot of room for improvement in our churches today. I know that pastors, being one myself at one time for a little while, I know that pastors can get bogged down. I believe that they can get in a place to where they can be spiritually dead. The load is so heavy they can't carry it. They can get in a place where they won't even care. They just go to church Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. They provide sermon after sermon after sermon, and they lose the heart for it. They lose the drive for it. They're tired. They're weary, worn out in some places, and they do need help. They absolutely need help to carry out all the functions of the church. No one person has got the strength to do that, and I know that. But ripping out the senior pastor and replacing him with elders, and I just don't believe that's the answer. I believe that Mr. Moreland has some grand ideas and some grand ways of improving the health of the church. I just think he's going about it the wrong way. I don't think he's thought that through. It's been my experience that it's hard to get folks to commit to extracurricular activity, such as education, that we need so badly in the church. Mr. Moreland touched on the idea of a library in the church. Well, the only library I've ever seen in a church may be in the pastor's office. There may be a few books in there, maybe a set of commentaries or what have you, but as far as educating the church, you got to have commitment by the people in order to educate the church. You can't educate people that don't see the need to be educated. You can't hardly get people to commit to go to church and sit through 3 sermons a week, let alone any extracurricular activity. I absolutely agree with Mr. Moreland on the educational aspect of the church. We do need education, but how do we get there? That's the question that I'm left with. I believe there's a difference, a vast difference in preaching and teaching. In closing tonight, I'd like to say I do believe Moreland's suggestions are certainly plausible. His ideas does, in fact, warrant an exhausted study. However, I also feel like in order to get any of these suggestions placed into action, it's going to take a lot of change in the church body, and change is something people just do not like. Beginning with the pastor and the board members or the elders, the church body's got to come together in unity and agree that the life of the Christian mind is in fact in need of revitalizing, and agree that the church needs to rise up and move forward, come out of the past, march into today, and study and educate ourselves for tomorrow in order to meet the challenges that's ahead of us. I believe all of these suggestions is possible. Maybe some churches, according to their size, whether they be larger or smaller scale churches, but also most of these suggestions will require commitment by all, not just the pastor, not just the elders. In theory, I believe Mr. Moreland gives a great argument with his thesis regarding the current state of the church. But I wonder tonight if even half of the suggestions that Mr. Moreland has suggested in this book is practical. I believe Mr. Moreland's out of touch with local churches. He's not even in reality on some of these things. He's got a good argument, but after reading chapter 10 of this book, I'm left with more questions than I had before I started reading this book. He had me hooked on chapters 1 through 5. But chapter 10 has really caused me to think hard and look for ways and look for ideas in order to get things done. I don't feel like as a pastor, I've gained any help from most of Mr. Moreland's suggestions. Thank you, and good night.